Here I am, ready for my interview to enter the academy. Yes, sir. I actually got this from my friend's wedding that I went to a couple months ago, but it just looked so militaristic that I had to wear it for this video about power. Yes. So this video is about power as a concept, but I think that not only is this going to be a kind of analysis of power, but maybe a question as to how it relates to history, the age that we're in now. More than any other concept, power seems most relevant to our understanding about the political age that we're in right now, with its individual groups that are fighting for autonomy, recognition by the state, by capital. And there's this tension and contradiction going on within these fights where everyone's trying to figure out what is the locus that bears the legitimation of this fight that we're having. Do we recourse to an idea of truth? Do we recourse to an idea of a normative value that can give our stance some kind of force behind it? Power as a concept comes in and kind of disrupts this whole framework with its charge that would say something along the lines of like, everyone from individual subjects to collectives are seeking power. This power does not rely on any, let's say, transcendental signifier, some other or outside for legitimation, but seeks to legitimate itself by its own volition, or what Nietzsche calls its own will, what he will theorize famously as the will to power. So, in this video, I want to ask, what is power, of course, and furthermore, what does it mean for us today? How can it affect our movements, both creative, political? And with that unpacking, I think that we'll be able to see something that is unique to our age, unique to the modern age, that something like a concept of power is needed for in order to understand. All right, so before we start getting into how power exhibits itself in subjects and historical periods, I think we first need to just open it up. Let's just look at how power works, perhaps at a kind of empirical level, a metaphysical level, something where we can just find out the raw kind of stuff behind it. For this question, I think that it's best not to start with going to Nietzsche, even though I think Nietzsche is the one who is really starting this whole question and analysis of power, but one of his heirs. And that'll be the heir of Deleuze. So this is Deleuze's book on Nietzsche. I think that the way that he explores power in this book is somewhat of his own invention. He does take up a lot of like really good scholarship on Nietzsche. He presents a really thorough analysis, but as with most things Deleuze does, he puts his own spin on it and kind of uses it to develop his own project. So what does he do with power in this book? He, first and foremost, draws out the distinction between what he calls force and power. So force is this kind of metaphysically present principle, you might say, or intensity, I think he'll later start like developing. Forces always exist between objects in the world, situations, ideas, and they first manifest as a difference between two things. And this is very important. For Deleuze, force cannot exist independently of its own. This will be somewhat in contrast to power, but force cannot exist on its own. Force always requires there to be two things involved, two agents or actors. These two, once they come into a conflict of some kind or they bump up against each other, begin to establish their difference by quantity. Deleuze says that every force that encounters another force makes its own distinction by the quantitative degree that it is higher, more forceful, or lesser, weaker, less forceful. If a force is inseparable from its quantity, it is no more separable from the other forces which it relates to. Quantity itself is therefore inseparable from difference in quantity. Difference in quantity is the essence of force, and of the relation of force to force. To dream of two equal forces, even if they are said to be of opposite senses, is a coarse and approximate dream, a statistical dream in which the living is submerged, but which chemistry dispels. Each time that Nietzsche criticizes the concept of quantity, we must take it to mean that quantity as an abstract concept always and essentially tends towards an identification, an equalization of the unity that forms it, and an annulment of difference in this unity. Nietzsche's reproach to every purely quantitative determination of forces is that it annuls, equalizes, or compensates for differences in quantity. So there's a few things going on here. First, he's talking about how when we're talking about the quantity of forces, we cannot talk about them in this relationship of equality, right? Nietzsche criticizes this scientistic view that science is able to fully grant itself a perspective of the quantity of forces in a way that can be fully exchangeable, translatable between their differences. Nietzsche wants to restore to life a kind of differential vitalism that is, as you can see, already troubling to the potentially democratizing, equalizing tendency inside of this scientific discourse. We'll get into this more when we get into Foucault, but all that is to say that once we start talking about forces as being differential, ones that cannot be equalized, we've already started unnerving the kind of democratization field in which like science wants to grasp at the universe. This will become a social problem. Because the moment that we start talking about power from a lens that isn't about equality, but is about a kind of vital differentiation, we've started entering a kind of anarchic territory. And this is why the question of power is so important for us. Okay, so now that we've talked about the quantitative difference within force, we can move on to what stems from this quantitative difference, which is where things start getting more interesting, and that is the qualitative differences. When two forces that are quantitatively different, one is weaker, one is stronger, come into contact, it's not this simplistic, vulgar, the stronger one divorces the weaker one, and that's that. That is a kind of nostalgia that one feels sometimes as if Nietzsche lapses into. These blonde beasts of prey, these masters that ran the world, they just had stronger force and they suppressed the weaker, and then they interpreted the world around that. That era is gone. And Nietzsche knows that too, even though I think sometimes he gets into a nostalgia for it. But what happens is that these quantitative differences create qualitative distinctions. And this is where valuation starts to come in. The whole point of Deleuze's book on Nietzsche is a kind of reappropriation of Kant under this view of Nietzsche's idea of power. So Kant's whole thing is like the subject creates a kind of deontological ethics, and that is something that can be applied universally across the board. And so the subject has this freedom inside of themselves that touches everyone potentially, and this is a valuing like subject. This subject values things by saying like this is the right course of action, and I also think that this right course of action is applicable to a universal framework. Everyone can relate to it. This is a normative mode of thinking that like Kant is delving into. But what Deleuze wants to explore through this Nietzschean perspective is that valuation is derived from differences within these forces at a quantitative level that then branches out into qualitative perspectives. And these qualitative perspectives show the sense and the coloring behind how we value things. And this is why power as a concept becomes so troubling, because that means that there isn't a universal import behind them. There is a particular import behind them. And that these are potentially driven from contingent situations. One thing has more force than another, and both of these perspectives that become generated out of that difference seek their own legitimation, but they have no means of being able to communicate really with one another. The differences in this quality are what Nietzsche and Deleuze call the difference between reactive and active. So active quality will be on the side of the force that has a stronger quantity, whereas reactive will always be on the side of the force that has a lesser quantity. This shows that even in this fight, what ends up happening is that the one that was on the losing side of things can still perpetuate the struggle by becoming secretive, nuanced, full of interpretation and cunning. This will lead Deleuze to say that forces are alive. They interpret the world. They move about them. So how can a force that is reactive start interpreting things? So the classic example is Nietzsche's idea of the slave revolt in morality. Think about a people that have been oppressed for so long. Are they going to continue to say, like, we're weak and so we're, bad, we're wrong. If only we were powerful and strong, we'd be good, or whatever. Nietzsche's thought is that what ends up happening is that these forces that are lesser start repositioning the perspective to say, actually, those people that are stronger than us, because of their very power, are evil. And we're good. We're good because of our lack of force, because of our weakness. And this is the way in which forces that have lesser quantity, their quality changes through this reactionary energy. They're reacting to the fact that they're lesser. And this reaction means that the struggle between them is not over. It's not so simple as one has more force, one has lesser. And this is where force transfers into power as a concept. Force just remains at this kind of mechanical level, even though it's a vitally differential kind of mechanics, toward a more nuanced, embodied, social, you even might want to say, dimension that is power. Okay, so that's the difference between force and power. I'll read you guys a passage from Paul Patton's book, Deleuze and the Political. The will to power is the element from which derive both the quantitative difference of related forces and the quality that devolves into each force in this relation. While it does not bring the forces into relation, that task being left to chance, the will to power produces the difference in quantity and the resultant quality which each force acquires in a given relation. Although the quality of forces has its origin in quantitative difference, it is not bound by that original state of affairs. Cultural phenomena, no less than physical events, involve dynamic systems. As Nietzsche repeatedly argues, the weak may triumph over the strong. In On the Genealogy of Morality, he analyzes some of the principal forms of reactive force which have held sway over human nature, namely ressentiment, bad conscience, and the ascetic ideal. Reactive forces may get the better of the active ones, but they do not thereby become active, for the reason that their mode of operation is not the same. Nietzsche's view, according to Deleuze, is that the difference between active and reactive forces derives in the first instance from the difference in quantity. Active forces are those that dominate, while reactive ones are dominated. But this difference in the quality of forces cannot be reduced to quantitative differences alone. If it could, then the distinction would serve no critical purpose. whereas Deleuze clearly wants it to do so. Quote, inferior forces can prevail without ceasing to be inferior in quantity and reactive in quality. He therefore draws the distinction in terms of the difference between two modes of operation or functioning. Reactive forces are forces of limitation or decomposition, which resist the activity of other forces. They separate active force from what it can do, and in this way are able to overcome active forces by neutralizing some or all of their power. By contrast, active force is force that acts of its own accord. In doing so, it may impose forms upon lesser forces, or otherwise appropriate or subordinate them to its own ends. Active force goes to the limit of what it can do, even to the point of its own destruction and transmutation into something else. So now we get a clear picture of what power is at a kind of metaphysical level. A lot of these philosophers want to avoid using that word, metaphysics. Deleuze not so much. But it is a metaphysics of power, and it is a metaphysics that Foucault takes up, that Nietzsche was exploring, especially in his later years and in the unpublished work, The Will to Power. And we can see how this idea of power influences what Foucault says. Power's condition of possibility is the moving substrate of force relations which, by virtue of their inequality, constantly engender states of power. He will go on to say that power is everywhere, not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere. So here we have the understanding of power. It is a transcendental field in which different forces of different quantity meet, and through that meeting create qualitative differences. These qualitative differences transfer force into a realm of power. This power is an ongoing process that involves nuance, interpretation, cunning, and it means that things that may have weaker force can still triumph. And this is where it starts becoming a question of the political. What this conception of power has changed in regards to the way we question sovereignty. Deleuze, Nietzsche, and Foucault are all thinkers that really change the nature of how we're going to think about politics from the way we have before. The way we have before has been primarily thinking about it in its relation to the king, the president, the government, the state. And it always involves a kind of question of representation, representing people's different ideals, and those seem to be ones that can be thought of in a normative framework, and that this is always then a question of morality. But the whole point of why Nietzsche changed the game is by showing that morality is not this Kantian thing that can be applied universally, but is rather something that is always produced. It is created by different subject positions, different bodies in this transcendental field of different power relations, and that those are immanent, that they are ones that have a sense of their own that are non-equalizable. Here's a passage from Paul Patton's book. Deleuze has had a profound impact on contemporary approaches to the theory of power. Through his studies of the philosophies of Nietzsche and Spinoza, he develops a concept of power which has none of the juridical and moral presuppositions typically associated with power in the tradition of modern political thought. He's talking about Nietzsche here and the difference that his conception of power differs from previous thinkers. First, he refuses any perspective according to which the fundamental drive is to preserve or to increase the power of the body concerned. For Nietzsche, will to power is not a matter of individual bodies striving to maintain their power or persevere in their being, in the manner of Hobbes or Spinoza. It is not energy expended in order to reach a particular goal or end state, but simply the expenditure of energy itself. The power of a body is expressed when it acts with all the force or energy with which it is endowed. So that is the first difference. A second fundamental point of difference between Nietzsche and his predecessors with regard to power is that he treats it as a matter of effective capacity on the part of the body concerned, rather than as something represented and therefore able to be recognized or not by others. Deleuze suggests that according to Hobbes, quote, man in the state of nature wants to see his superiority represented and recognized by others, end quote. By contrast, for Nietzsche, it is only the slave who understands power in terms of representation, since this is a mediocre and base interpretation of power. Any such representational concept of power is prone to an implicit conformism, since it implies that an individual will only be recognized as powerful in accordance with accepted values. So here are two important differences in this conception of power. One is that power does not have an end goal in mind, and the other is that power does not seek a kind of equalizing representational mode where basically we can all be the same, right? And this is what power as a theory is getting at and why it is so disruptive. So in the first question, or the first difference, it means that power, either of our own individual bodies, the body of the nation, is not approaching a kind of final good state of homeostasis, right? Let's say that most people think about the goal of politics is to create the good state, a good situation in which the nation is representing the people's will in a kind of organic one-to-one ratio. And, this is done by representative democracy. However, if power is this kind of vital field in which differences of bodies are constantly meeting and fighting and interpreting, then that idea doesn't really make sense. And that means then that the state or the nation is a kind of ideological framework that is legitimating its own end by saying like, well, we are the good end goal and we work in tandem with one another. Don't you guys want to help us be the best versions of ourselves? Don't you want us to be the good state for you? This doesn't make sense if power is this purely expending thing, this thing that enjoys its own proliferation, even to the point of self-transformation and self-destruction. The idea of an end goal or a state or a nation of fixity would be something that is deluded because it believes that it can fix itself in a final perspective, in a final attainment or goal. And this is different even than like Nietzsche's idea that things, bodies, always self-overcome. They struggle into existence. Once they are existing at the top or, achieve their goal, they then plateau, atrophy, and peter out, usually into a kind of simulacra. I think you can say that this is exactly what has happened to our nation. Our nation has competed on the world stage to become this global power, has kind of plateaued, and is now going through this period of strange self-overcoming where it's become a kind of simulacra of itself, and it seems to be kind of self-deteriorating. But I won't go into that too much right now. The second fundamental difference is this one about how representation works and how this equality is something that doesn't make sense if the forces that are derived from different bodies coming into contact with one another are always of a quantitative and therefore a qualitative difference. One way that you can see this coming about is the idea that, well, those who are weaker just want to be recognized by those who have more power. As Nietzsche and Deleuze will say, this idea of representation, which always involves a kind of norm, like we, like everyone else, want to be represented and have our ideas accounted for and our wishes, is from, first and foremost, a perspective of servitude, of the slave's perspective of what power means. According to the slave's perspective, power looks like them being accounted for, them being represented. But from the perspective of the person who really has power, who has more quantity of power, that doesn't make sense. They're just expending this power naturally, just enjoying themselves in the world. They don't think about being represented but represented by who? Themselves. And this is the important point about valuation here. The powerful, those who have more quantity of force, will give their interpretation, their valuation and sense of the world from the perspective in which they are in. And this is just a kind of organic affirmative process that doesn't have much interpretation behind it, whereas the perspective that is coming from the slavish perspective has a lot of interpretation behind it because it's essentially reactive. It's reacting to its servitude and therefore begins this kind of discursive process of interpretation. So we can see how this idea of power that is developed through Deleuze, Nietzsche, and Foucault is troubling to our understanding of democracy, right? As far as democracy understands itself to be working toward an ideal social configuration and as being representational in nature. Both of these concepts are blown apart by this idea of power and will continue to be troubling in the world that we live in, right? Our world is made up of these different bodies, some large, some small, competing with different interests. They're the interests of the queer community, of Black people, of trans people, or what have you, different marginalized groups. Then there is normative groups or seemingly normative groups, frameworks of mind. There's different nations. There's the natural world versus, say, like the industrial world. And really, you can see how these different bodies are formed around their tension that they have with one another. That these identities are also fluid because of these tensions and can be transformed potentially. But they can't so much be transformed if we take each one of these bodies and the power that they're exhibiting as moving toward a homeostasis of some kind. This means that they're cut off from any kind of active transmutation of working together, trying to create scenarios that are challenging but interesting. There's something so banal about the nation that we live in now, the United States. No one really believes in the values that it spouts anymore, but no one has any alternatives because they're too terrifying. If we're no longer just fighting for the ideal state, and if we're no longer fighting for representation by the people that are governing us, how do we operate politically, right? I think that that is the fear that we're having. One of the answers to this is that each one of these groups that is fighting militantly for its own values are doing so immorally, not in the sense that they're doing something like evil per se, just that they're doing it for the sake of power's operation. They want power. Queer people want power. Black people want power. And they shouldn't have to recourse to any kind of normative framework because that normative framework was always co-opted by the state that is trying to normalize its own power in the first place, right? Foucault's work, especially in the period from Discipline and Punish onwards, is really good at fleshing out this reality that power relations on the side of different apparatuses like schools, prisons, hospitals seek to normalize the different bodies of the people within them by disciplining them, making them obedient. And the way that they first and foremost do this is by contradicting those two differences that we were discussing earlier with regards to power. They want to normalize and discipline the body so it's not this free expenditure of a thing. And it also wants to normalize and make the body obedient by equalizing it, by saying we're all kind of the same and we all have to be the same, and that's how we can have a smooth, well-functioning society. But this is not the case, right? It's too easy, I think, to criticize like all these normative frameworks of understanding the state, that without the state, everything would be this lawless disorder and stuff like that. I don't even want to argue against that. It's just so stupid. One that I think can be criticized is, say, a framework that like Rorty or Jürgen Habermas have, which is this idea that like, okay, there's different competing values in a society. Let's say like abortion. On the one hand, there's going to be people that say the fetus is a human life, we cannot abort it. then there's going to be people on the other side that say the fetus isn't really, the fetus isn't human life, and so it should be able to be aborted, whatever. We can't come to a conclusion about the fetus, but instead there is a kind of compromise within democracies where they say, okay, well, let's say at 3 months, the fetus can't be aborted or whatever. They can't really give a reason behind that. No one can really justify like why the fetus is more or less of a human given this time frame. But it's just this kind of pragmatic compromise that happens. And the idea that is proposed by like Rorty and Jürgen Habermas about this is just like, okay, there is no right answer to it. There is no truth. There is rather just a kind of solution that is gained in the ideal situation of a public sphere that has enough communicative transparency behind it. Now, this kind of idea that like democracies just function smoothly if everyone can communicate freely, represent themselves freely, doesn't make sense when we start delving into different individual bodies of marginalized groups that are seeking power for themselves. Not to mention the fact that, well, this nation that may be a public sphere that has democratic values still requires exploitation of other beings, the natural world, other sites outside of its own national sovereignty where it seeks to have power over. It doesn't seem to work, and it still functions off of that mode of the ideal scenario, the ideal state, operating under representation. So this is where it starts getting into, a framework of mind that is not the most pleasing, I think, to us, because we think that we need politics to function around the idea of the good, the true, the stable. But this has always been a kind of ideological apparatus that those who have power enact over those who don't. The state always wants to claim its own goodness while at the same time doing abhorrent things. If individual bodies of people, of groups, seek power, they cannot do it within this ideological framework that the state doesn't even abide by. It's going to need to enact this will to power from its own affirmative basis. It affirms its own will to power without recourse to God, the truth, or the state to legitimize it. And this is why power as a modern concept is so troubling and potentially so liberating. We can harness this concept and this framework of power for liberation because it no longer is going to rely on the thing oppressing us in the first place. And this is something that a thinker like Fanon knew when it came to slave rebellion and Black liberation. We in marginalized positions, those who are oppressed by the state, are never going to liberate ourselves if we require the state to recognize us. This politics of recognition doesn't make sense if those who are oppressing us do not actually see us as consequential. And this is why Fanon said that the politics of recognition only works if those who have power over you, if the master fears you. And this is the way that we'll liberate ourselves, by embracing power as something that no longer needs the state's consent.